All right, A pushers. So here we go. We're in the middle of a war, right? We've got the Civil War broke out. The South told the North, don't elect a Republican. The North did it. We got Abraham Lincoln. The South said, hasta la vista, I'm out, and we're at war. So here we go. We're going to end the war. The blood stops for a while. Ending the war and beginning the hard part. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the actual fighting of the war because the APUSH test doesn't test over military history, right? They're not interested in who won this battle and what this battle was and all that. So we're not going to deal with the war a whole lot. We're dealing with the issues that caused the war, issues that came up during the war, and the issues following the war. The war in and of itself, we're not going to really deal with all that much in any war, right? We didn't talk a whole lot about what happened during the Revolutionary War. We didn't talk a whole lot about what happened during the War of 1812. And we're not going to talk a lot about this or what happens during World War I or World War II, right? It's not tested. Some of it's pretty interesting, but it's not tested. And especially in our COVID world, we just don't have the time. So here we go. The blood stops for a while. And this is, we're going to do the fill in the blank note. So if you're doing this online, if you're watching this online, you should have your fill in the blank notes ready. And there is the blue highlighted dash. That's where you're going to fill in the words as they come up, right? The notes have already been taken for you. You just need to fill in the blanks. And as the word will pop up on the screen, just put them in the blue highlighted area. Hopefully this works. This is totally new. We're going to give it a shot. If it doesn't work, let me know and we won't do it again. All right, here we go. On September 22nd, Lincoln is going to issue, 1862, Lincoln's going to issue one of the most famous pieces of legislation in American history. Okay. Now, it sounds really impressive. You've probably heard about it, but did it really do what it was supposed to do? The Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, it sounds really exciting, right? So here's what it says. All of those slaves that are living in areas, all of those slaves that are living in states that are now in open rebellion against the United States are now free. Let me say that again. All of those slaves who are residing, who are living in states that are now in open rebellion, that are fighting against the United States, are now free. So the slaves are free? Oh, no, they're not free at all. Because the states that are in open rebellion are in the South. They're in a confederacy. It's a totally different country. Totally different country down there. We can't pass laws for other countries. The United States can't pass a law for Cuba or for Canada or for England, right? We can't pass laws for other countries. So how many slaves does this free? Yeah, exactly nothing. Oh boy. So why does he issue this law that says all slaves are free when in fact the slaves are not free? Oh, I'm glad you asked. He does it to appease radical Republicans. 1862 is a midterm elections. There's a faction, a very strong, very loud faction of the Republican Party called the Radical Republicans. And for them, there is one issue and one issue only, and there is one reason and one reason only why this war is being fought, and that is to end slavery. Okay? That is to end slavery. Up to this point in time, Lincoln's whole goal fighting this war, remember Lincoln is chosen because of his soft views on slavery. Lincoln's whole vision, whole goal of this war was not necessarily to end slavery. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's wrong, but he's fine with it where it is. His whole goal of the war, his whole mission of the war, up to this point, was to bring the Union back together, was to preserve the country. That's why he was fighting this war. Slavery was not an issue for him. He didn't want it to grow, but he wasn't necessarily saying, we got to get rid of it. That does not make him very popular with radical Republicans, whose only mission in their life at this time was to end slavery, was abolitionism. Lincoln is anti-slavery. He's not an abolitionist. So this is an attempt to appease radical Republicans in an election year, midterm elections, 1862, who are not happy at all with Lincoln. They think Lincoln is too soft and too friendly and not strong enough against slavery. This is an attempt to appease radical Republicans. Who believe that the only focus of the war should be to free slaves. Lincoln also wants to stop any support that the South might be getting from England. England is really close to getting into this war on the side of the South, because the South has things England needs. England needs access to the cotton. There's nothing in the North that the North has that England necessarily wants or needs. England does need cotton for their textile mills and their industries back in England. And because of the war, any access to cotton that England has is extraordinarily limited. And it's beginning to affect England's economy. So England is about to get in this war on the side of the South. And Lincoln issues this as a reminder to England. Oh, nay. Before you get involved in this war, remember what you would be fighting for, and that is to preserve slavery. And slavery is immensely unpopular in England at this time. England has outlawed slavery about 50 years prior to this. So Lincoln does this to remind England, don't get involved in this war because you will be fighting to preserve slavery. So that's one of the things. The other reason why he issues this was to decrease any slave labor that the South had. He was hoping that word would get to slaves in the South that Lincoln is now saying you are free, and encourage them to escape, encourage more slave runaways to the North where they would be free. So it was an attempt to lessen slave labor in the South. It also is a turning point for Lincoln, who is now signaling to the radical Republicans that his goal in this war is not necessarily to bring the country back together. His mission has now changed to include the abolition of slavery. So this marks a turning point in the evolution of Lincoln's philosophies. All right, as the war drags on, the longer this war goes, the more the South struggles. Early on in a war, the South wins all the time. The South is always winning. But as the war drags on, it becomes more and more problematic for the South. The South, as the war drags on, is running very short of supplies. They're running short of ammunition. They're running short of uniforms. They're running short on food. Just everything that they need to prosecute this war, they're beginning to run out of. They're running out of men. The South doesn't have anywhere near the population that the North has. So losses, heavy losses in battles of Confederate soldiers is very, very, very damaging to the South. And maybe more importantly, as this war drags on, the South is running very short of money. Something you desperately need to fight a war. On the other hand, the North has all of these things. The North has more supplies than they could possibly want. They've got all the factories, so they can manufacture a lot of this. The North has a lot of farmland, particularly around the Great Lakes region. The North has lots and lots of people, so they have more men to come up and fill their ranks. And they've got all the money. So what is it that the North doesn't have? What the North doesn't have that the South does have and has a lot of is military leadership. Military leadership in the North is pretty bad. They've got a few good leaders, but most of them are not very good. The South, for whatever reason, most of the military leaders who are really, really good, who are very talented at this time, all happen to be Southerners. And that military leadership helps overcome a lot of these shortcomings that the South does have, particularly early on in the war. But eventually, all of these problems of the South become very problematic and too hard to overcome, despite having a huge advantage in military leadership. So we move to the end of the war. 1863, 1864. The North has a new general in charge of all the Union armies. Lincoln goes through several generals to lead the Union Army, and he finally settles on this guy, General Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant is beginning to push his armies, the Union Army from the north into the South. He's moving into Virginia, and he's slowly making his way towards the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. And as he's getting closer and closer to Richmond, the fighting becomes more and more intense and becomes bloodier and bloodier and bloodier. A really good example of this is the Battle of Cold Harbor. Oh, there's some dead guys, lots of dead guys, right? Is at the Battle of Cold Harbor. So here's what happens. This battle is extraordinarily late in the war. It's very late in the war. And it's going to be an extraordinarily bloody, deadly, awful battle. Before the battle takes place, Union soldiers who are well aware of probably what's going to happen, understanding that the war has become much more intense and much deadlier, Union soldiers begin to write and pin their names to their uniforms so that if they're killed in battle, their bodies can be quickly identified. They don't have dog tags quite yet. So they write their names and put it on their uniform so they could be identified if they're killed in battle. In the first 30 minutes of the battle, first half hour of the battle, 3,000 Union troops are killed. That's twice the population of Pomona High School. In 30 minutes, that many men are killed. Woof! That's a lot. Now, during this war, or during this battle, many of the wounded will lay on the battlefield for days because there's so many of them who are injured, many of them mortally wounded, and there's not enough doctors to take care of them. So they lay on the battlefield for days as they slowly bleed to death. Oof. In the early stages of the Virginia campaign, General Grant loses 60,000 men. In the early first stages, first couple of weeks of this campaign, he loses 60,000 soldiers. Oof. Lee, on the other hand, the leader of the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee, loses 30,000 men. They lose half of what the Union lost. The difference being the Union can replace most of these 60,000 men. The Confederacy, not so much. Oh boy. And Grant continues to drive towards Richmond. as Grant is pushing towards Richmond, in the South, there is a Union general by the name of Richard Sherman, or Tecumseh Sherman, not Richard Sherman. Tecumseh Sherman. And Tecumseh Sherman has been moving across the South here. You can see my cursor. He's been moving across the South, just ripping the heart out of the South. And as he goes across the South, he destroys everything in his wake. It's called the scorched earth policy. He's just destroying and burning everything in his wake. When he gets to Atlanta, he burns Atlanta to the ground. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind or read the book Gone with the Wind, at the end, they talk about they can see the flames of Atlanta in the distance. That's Sherman coming across the South and burning everything in his wake, burning Atlanta to the ground. He marches all the way to the coast, and then once he gets to the coast of the Atlantic, he begins marching northward, again, destroying everything in his path as he moves from South and North Carolina. And he begins going towards Virginia. So what you're getting is the South is getting into is getting squeezed here, right? You've got Grant coming from the north, moving towards Richmond, and now you've got Sherman moving up from the south towards Richmond. So they're really it's called a pincer move. They're coming in and they're surrounding the Confederate army. Realizing he's in a hopeless situation, he can't win, Lee surrenders. And there's Lee signing the surrender papers. This is Lee, and this is Grant. Lee signs surrender papers to Grant on April 9th, 1865. And he surrenders at a town. It's called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. It's not a courthouse. It's the name of the town. It's Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And on April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, great story, right? I mean, history is full of great stories. That's what makes history so cool, are these stories. Here's the story. The very first, organized battle, I guess you could say, during the Civil War takes place in a farm just outside of Washington, D.C., in Manassas, Virginia. And it takes place on this farm. And it's one of the very, very first battles that takes place. And it's called the Battle of Bull Run. And it takes place on this guy's farm. Well, this guy who just had the Civil War fought basically in his front yard goes, "Whoo, not a good place to be." So he sells off his farm and he moves to get his family away from the war. So he sells the farm where the war broke out, basically on his front lawn, and he moves his family to a different place. At the end of the war, when it's decided that Lee is going to surrender, Lee and Grant are going to meet in this town, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And they're going to meet in the nicest house that they can find, the nicest, richest house that they can find so they can sign these papers. The house that they choose happens to be the house of the guy who owned the farm in Manassas. Oh! So the war breaks out in his front yard in Manassas, Virginia in 1861. 4 years later, the war ends in his front room in a different house in a different town. Oh, what a crazy story, right? Holy smokes. So, shortly after this, the Union Army begins this massive search for the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. They find him on May 10th, 1865, in New Orleans. Crazy story there. They're looking for Jefferson Davis to arrest him for basically for treason. And they can't find him. And they're looking everywhere, looking for him, and they can't find him. Well, the way that they find him is in New Orleans. And he's dressed as a woman. He's in a dress and a bonnet and everything. And he's trying to get on a ship to escape to England. And Union soldiers happen to spot him walking down the street in New Orleans in a dress and arrest him. And Jefferson Davis is, although he could have been executed, Lincoln said, we're not going to execute him. And they put him in jail for 2 years. Now, the final tally of this war for both sides is staggering. Unbelievable what this war cost both sides in terms of money and men. Both sides will spend $20 billion. That's $1865. That's a lot of money in 1865. $20 billion. And 620,000 men will be killed. Over 500,000 men will be killed in 5 years. Woof! And maybe more importantly, 4 million slaves are freed. All right. So now that we've ended the war, we've got to figure out a way how to bring the country back together, right? We've been so divided and we fought a war over this division. Now, the hard part, really, the fighting of the war was pretty easy. The hard part's going to be trying to bring the country back together. Lincoln has a plan on how he's going to bring the country back together. Lincoln decides he wants to make it as easy as possible for the South to come back into the Union. Lincoln believes that not all the Southerners who fought in this war, not all the Southerners are against the Union, right? A lot of them are probably just people who, they're Southerners because they live in the South, but they're not necessarily anti-Union. And a lot of the Southerners are not Confederates, right? I mean, think of during World War II, not all Germans are Nazis, right? That's just not true. So Lincoln says not everybody that lives in the South was against the Union, and not everybody that lives in the South are Confederates. And not all the Confederates are necessarily bad people, right? They just have different beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily make them bad. Lincoln also wants to make sure, however, that slavery is a done and dead issue forever. Slavery can never come back because of all the problems and damage that it did to the country. So he wants to make sure slavery is done forever. Lincoln does believe that secession, leaving the country, is illegal. He does not believe that the Southern states had the constitutional authority to secede from the Union. And this illegal act, Lincoln says, was really driven by just a handful of Southerners. It's not most Southerners who did this. It was a handful of Southerners. And those are the people that need to be punished. It's the people that drove secession. They need to be punished, not the entire South. Because Lincoln believes most of the South would have never left the war or left the Union. So in Lincoln's mind, since the majority of people never supported leaving the Union, the South really never left the Union. So we need to punish these guys who are really pushing the secession. Okay? We need to remove all of these people from power that drove secession. And we need to get people in power. We need to replace them with people who are loyal to the Union and who will not take such radical measures. So With all of this in mind, Lincoln's going to draw up his plan for Reconstruction. In 1863, Lincoln issues his plan for secession. It's called the 10% Plan. And here's how it works. Citizens of the South would have to take an oath of loyalty. They say, I swear, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. I swear I am loyal to the Union. And we will obey all of the laws that have been passed in the Union during the war. If they do that, all of their property that they may have lost will be returned to them. Okay? The only people who couldn't get their property back, no matter what they said or what they did, any Confederate official who lost their property, who had their property taken away during the war, they could not get it back. And this, by the way, is how we get the most famous cemetery in the world and the largest cemetery in the world, Arlington. Arlington was the plantation of Robert E. Lee. And it was taken during the course of the war. And since Robert E. Lee was the Confederate general, he didn't get his property back. He didn't get his plantation back. And then we figured, we got all these dead guys. Let's bury him in Robert E. Lee's front yard. And that's what they started doing. So that's how we get Arlington. We confiscated his property. He could never get it back. Other citizens of the South could get their property back if they took an oath and promised not to cause problems. Now, when the number of citizens taking this oath that they will be loyal to the Union, once that equaled 10% of the people who had voted in that state in the 1860 election, and a new state constitution had been written, which was loyal to the Union, that state would just come back into the Union. So once the number of people in this, say, Alabama, took an oath, and it was 10% of the people who had voted in the 1860 election, which was the last presidential election when all of the states were together. Once that number reached 10% and the state had written a new state constitution, they were in. So again, let's say in Alabama, let's say in 1860, just to make it really, really simple, say 100 people voted in Alabama in 1860. Under this plan, once 10 people, 10%, 10 people had taken an oath, Alabama had written a new state constitution saying that they would never cause problems again, they were back in. It was that simple, right? Lincoln also said Southern leaders, all Southerners, need to free their slaves, and more importantly than free them, they must educate them, which at that time meant reading and writing, right? You have to teach them how to read. You have to teach them how to write. You can't just turn them loose with nothing, right? They've got to have some skills to survive, and that means they need to know how to read or write. Okay. Lincoln also wants to make it possible for newly freed blacks who were educated, who owned land, who had been helpful to the United States. He wants them to have the right to vote. He thought that was very important that they get the right to vote. Almost immediately, the states of Arkansas and Louisiana adopt this plan, as does Tennessee. Yay! However, radical Republicans don't like it. They think this is too soft, this is too kind, this is too nice, and this is too easy for the South. Radical Republicans at the end of this war want the South, all of the South, and all of its people to be severely punished for what they've done. Oh boy. Well, good news is for the radical Republicans, they don't need to worry about this for too long because it's not going to last. And it's not going to last because of this guy. John Wilkes Booth, there's 3 blanks there that you have to fill in. John Wilkes Booth is a famous actor at the time. He's a very famous actor at the time. He's very well known, but he's not as famous and he's not as good as his father was, which is something that, kind of grinds on him. You always tell John Wilkes Booth, you're pretty good, but you're not your dad, right? So that kind of grinds on him. Booth is a loyal, rabid, faithful supporter of the South and the South's cause. Believes in slavery, believes in states' rights, and believes what the South was doing is absolutely right. However, Booth could never bring himself to enlist to fight in the Confederate Army, right? He never is able to work up the courage to enlist in the Confederate Army to fight. I don't know. Catching a bullet just never really appealed to him for whatever reason. Yeah. At the end of the war, at the end of the war, Booth is so angry at how the war ends, and maybe he has some self-guilt. And so Wilson, I don't know why I keep calling him Wilson. Booth believes that he could make up for his cowardness of not fighting by killing the person he saw as responsible for defeat of the South and everything that the South stood for. So he has a plan. He wants to kill Lincoln. Now, originally, he had a different plan, right? The killing of Lincoln was his second plan. His first plan was to kidnap Lincoln, right? And he had this very weird plan. He was going to show up at this hotel that Lincoln was staying at. He was going to ask to see the president, and he was going to go up and kidnap him. Right? Well, he never got to see Lincoln. Right? He tried to he actually went to the hotel and tried to see Lincoln, and the soldiers who were protecting him said, no, the reason you want to see Lincoln is not legit. So he never got to see Lincoln. So he never got a chance to kidnap Lincoln. And his plan was he was going to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage and then exchange him for some Confederate prisoners of war. And this was all going to take place during the Civil War so that the South could have more soldiers. Obviously, it doesn't work. He never gets to Lincoln. So now the war ends, and John Wilkes Booth is going to come up with a different plan. And it's going to take place here. This is Ford's Theater. This is how Ford's Theater looks today, actually. On April 14th, 1865, just days after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln and his wife go to Ford's Theater, and they take with them a high-ranking Union general and his wife as their guest. And they're going to see this play. It's a very famous play at the time called My American Cousin. It's a comedy. Okay? This was the day, once Booth finds out that Lincoln's going to this play, Booth and his accomplices come up with a plan that they believe will bring the Union to its knees and restart the Civil War, as the South will rise from the ashes like a phoenix once Booth and his accomplices do what their dastardly deeds are going to be. The plan is one of Booth's accomplices was going to go to the Secretary of State's house and stab the Secretary of State, whose name was Henry Seward, and kill him. So he was going to go to this place where Henry Seward is staying, stab him to death, and get him out of the way. And then another guy was going to go to Andrew Johnson's house and kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. And then Booth was going to take care of Lincoln himself. At this time in the American presidency, there are 3 people in line to be the president. right? There's the president. If something happens to the president, then we know it's the vice president, right? The Whigs find that out when they keep dying. So it's president and the vice president. And if something happens to the vice president, then it goes to the Secretary of State, which at this time is Henry Seward. If something happens to the Secretary of State, I don't know, right? There's nothing else in line there to take over. So Booth's plan is, let's kill Lincoln, let's kill Johnson, let's kill Seward. The North will have nobody in charge. It'll be chaos, and the South will see this as an opportunity and rise and restart the Civil War, this time with a different outcome. That's their plan. So earlier in the day, Booth goes to Ford's Theater, and he's just kind of hanging around backstage. And even though he's not in the play, nobody really thinks much about it because, he's an actor, and that's what actors do. They just kind of hang around. So they're doing some rehearsing, and Booth is just kind of hanging around backstage, talking to people and so on and so forth. And then he gets an opportunity to go up the stairs to the presidential box, which is right here. Go to the president. He goes up the stairs, which the stairs to the presidential box are backstage, back here. So he goes up these stairs and he drills a hole in this wall that will be directly behind Lincoln. And then Booth goes home. The play begins. That night, Lincoln and his wife show up and they're watching the play, and the play's taking place, and it's a comedy. Booth also is backstage again. Again, nobody thinks much about it because, he's an actor, and even though he's not in the play, he's just kind of hanging out in the theater because, where's actors going to go? And there's one soldier, right? We don't have the Secret Service really yet. I mean, here's the ironic thing. A week before this happens, Lincoln had just signed a bill creating the Secret Service. Oh! So there's one soldier who's assigned to protect the president. He's at the bottom of the stairs. As the play is going, the one soldier who's assigned to protect Lincoln goes, everything looks pretty good, nothing crazy. So he goes out back to have a drink. When the soldier goes out back, Booth sees his opportunity, and he goes up the stairs and he watches Lincoln through that hole in the wall. Now Booth has performed in this play before, so he knows the play. And he knows that there's a particularly funny part of the play coming up where everybody will be laughing and not really paying much attention to what's going on around them. It's at this point that Booth jumps out from behind the wall, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, shoots the Civil War general, hits him in the hand. Booth jumps up on the railing here and jumps from the railing to the stage and announces to the crowd, he yells to the crowd, "Sic simpete Tyrannus! The South is avenged!" And he limps off stage and he jumps on a horse that's waiting for him. Now, the reason he limps off stage is because in the course of jumping from here to here, he landed wrong and he broke his leg. How about that? So Sic Semper Tyrannis is Latin, and it means death to the tyrants. So death to the tyrants, the South is avenged, is what John Wilkes Booth says in this very dramatic flair. Now, the guy who was going to kill Seward shows up at Seward's house. Seward goes, "Oh, it must be Domino's." And he opens up the door. As he opens up the door, this guy jumps in, going, yeah! And he stabs Seward, but he just stabs him once. And then he runs out into the street screaming. This guy gets arrested, right? The police see him and they figure, somebody's screaming and they're covered in blood and holding a knife. Probably a good reason to arrest him. They didn't know why, but they figured it would be a good thing to do. Seward is stabbed, but he doesn't die from it. He just, bleeds for a while. The guy who was going to kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson, chickened out. He never showed up. So Lincoln is carried from and it should be two words, not one word, as it shows there, boarding house. Lincoln is carried from the balcony here, and he's carried to this boarding house across the street from there, and he's put into a bed. A boarding house was like a hotel. It was like somebody's house, and you were renting one of their bedrooms. So there was this boarding house across the street, and they take Lincoln over there, and they put him into one of the beds in this boarding house, where Lincoln will die the following day, right? Now, Lincoln probably doesn't know that. Most of his brains are over here at the time. If you've ever been to Ford's Theater, you can go in there and you can see Ford's Theater. They still do plays there today. In the basement of the theater is this museum. It's a very cool museum. You can see the cloak that Lincoln was wearing that night, and you can still see the bloodstains on the cloak. And then you can go across the street to the boarding house, and you can see the bed that Lincoln was in. And whew, I'm telling you, people back then were short. You can see this bed. It's a teeny tiny bed. Now, Lincoln was abnormally tall for his time. He was like 6'4", 6'5", abnormally tall for his time. And you look at this bed and you go, my gosh, they must have folded Lincoln up to put him in here. But again, Lincoln probably didn't know because most of his brains were over here. So Lincoln dies the following day. Booth's accomplices were captured eventually, and they were convicted, and they were of treason, and they were immediately hanged. Booth will be captured a couple of days later. They surround him in a barn, and he's killed in a shootout with the army. Now, Andrew Johnson, who is a Southerner, he is now the vice president. Andrew Johnson now becomes president. A Southerner is going to be in charge of Reconstruction, bringing the country back together. Oh boy. And that's not going to go well at all. This is a picture of the four people who were involved in this plot to kill Lincoln and Vice President and Secretary of State. These four people, this lady here hid people out. That's why she got caught. So these are the four people who got caught, and this is their bodies after they were hung. Well, how about that? All right, so there we go. Hopefully this worked, that you guys were able to. I know there's a way to split the screen. So on one side of the screen you had the PowerPoint, and the other side of the screen you had the fill in the blank notes. Hopefully this worked for you guys. If it did, let me know. If it didn't, let me know, so we won't have to do this again. If it didn't work, if it did work, then we can probably do this a couple of more times and hopefully save you guys from writing a bunch of stuff, taking a bunch of notes. So that's it. So now we get into Reconstruction, which is probably my least favorite part of American history. It's a lot of work. A lot of things happen, or actually just the opposite. It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of stuff, but very little happens. It's a lot of stuff for a lot of nothing. So we're getting into Reconstruction. We finished the war. All right. We'll see you next time, Panthers.